Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of the Firestone Policy Forum. This is the inaugural event of an annual policy dialogue named after an iconic figure in environmental law, Judge Nancy Firestone of the Court of Federal Claims, who many of you in the room knew as a mentor, as a colleague, as a peer, as a teacher, and who left us far too soon. We are so honored that Nancy's family has chosen to remember and honor Nancy's legacy through this event hosted by ELI each year. Pat, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your support in making this possible. My name is Jordan Diamond, and I have the joyful privilege of serving as the president of the Environmental Law Institute. One of ELI's strengths is bringing people with wide-ranging, sometimes very divergent perspectives together to talk about things in good faith, with candor, and with facts at the ready. And that is why we are so excited about the conversation we're about to have today. This topic today, we are coming up on the 28th COP, or Conference of Parties, of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of the explicit goals of the Paris Climate Agreement is to do a global stocktake of progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions around the world. We are coming up on the first global stocktake. Many of you have maybe seen some of the technical documents coming around, some of the policy reports that are being put out in advance of this. But as we look ahead at COP28, this panel today is going to look at the question of what does this global stocktake mean? How far has the United States gotten in achieving its goals? What is the status of the efforts of the rest of the world to achieve their goals under their NDCs? And what exactly does the global stocktake mean in terms of our global climate policy? How is that going to affect the discussions at COP28 and the actions taken thereafter? We have an outstanding panel today to discuss these issues, to talk about what they have seen, what they are seeing, and what they hope to see coming up soon. I am going to leave it to Scott to introduce the panelists, but I have the honor of introducing Scott. Many of you already know Scott Fulton. He is the President Emeritus of the Environmental Law Institute. Prior to his time at ELI, he spent decades working on greenhouse gas emissions policy, largely through his work as the General Counsel and Assistant Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, among many other positions. He also currently serves on the steering committee of the IUCN Climate Crisis Commission. And if I were to read the rest of his bio, we would be here for the next 47 hours, so that's all I'm going to say, other than to thank you, Scott, for moderating today's panel, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Jordan, and greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. Am I live? Am I up? You hearing me? Okay. Before we launch into our program, permit me just another word or two about our namesake, Judge Nancy Firestone, as we work at the Institute to keep her memory alive. Nancy, of course, had a significant impact on our field well before her time as a judge on the Court of Federal Claims. This through her years of leadership at EPA and at the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division. And that's a legacy you can explore further in the program that you have before you. Those of you who had the privilege of working with her or appearing before her will remember her as a unique presence with an unusually sharp mind, quick wit, and clever pen. She was a teacher and mentor to many, yours truly included. Her capacity to read people and situations was second to none, and this made her an especially powerful advocate, an exceptional leader, and an extraordinary problem solver. It was fate, I think, that her penchant for problem solving would lead her to the bench. For those of you who didn't know her, maybe just a little inside baseball story to help you get in touch with who she was and her mark on our field. In the George Bush Senior administration, Nancy moved from the Justice Department to EPA to serve as Associate Deputy Administrator, really the senior most advisor to the administrator and the deputy administrator. She had recruited me to make the shift from DOJ to EPA as well, where I would serve in leadership at the Office of Enforcement. Now, it became clear early in the going that the fellow that I was working for, the Enforcement Assistant Administrator Jim Strock, known to many of you, had a secret agenda, one that would become mine as well. You see, Jim was keen on trying to consolidate EPA's enforcement operations, which were, at that time, spread out all across the agency's programs. Jim thought that this limited the agency's ability to march to a common enforcement beat and to quickly mobilize resources in response to the problems of the day. I agreed with him on all of this, so together we quietly developed a plan for consolidating EPA's enforcement operations. Now, by the time we had developed our pitch and our plan, we were into the third year of the administration. And when we took our opportunity and visited with the administrator and deputy administrator about it, much to our great disappointment, they didn't bite. Too disruptive, too distracting for the leadership team and the agency. No, we're not going to do it. So we kind of went off our tails between our legs, very unhappy because we put an enormous amount of work into this. So Nancy sought me out afterwards to try to make it better. Listen, she said, it's the right idea, but it's a timing problem. The only way you can pull off a major reorganization like this is at the very beginning of an administration, before all the members of the political team are firmly rooted and feeling protective of their domains. Save your work, she said. Maybe you can try again with a new group. As was often the case, Nancy turned out to be prescient. That administration would not get a second term, and in early 1993, in came the Clinton administration. Jim Strock had left to go run California EPA, and there I was, the transitional keeper of EPA's enforcement program, and on my shelf and at the ready, a consolidation plan and a pretty binder and a fully prepared deck of transparencies. Remember those? And working with my new boss, Steve Herman, there was an opportunity to get this in front of the new EPA administrator, Carol Browner, straight away. And looking for ways to put her own stamp on the agency, Carol embraced the plan, announced it, and off we ran, undertaking the biggest reorganization in EPA's history and producing a structure that has held, in essence, in all the years since. So if you've ever wondered how the once small Office of Enforcement became the bulked up Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, now you know. Nancy was, of course, right. Timing is everything. Context is everything. This is the kind of strategic insight and uncommon sense that Nancy brought to everything she touched. And when it came to our body of work, she touched practically everything in some way. Sometimes directly, other times indirectly, but no less powerfully. It always seemed to me that she cared precious little for getting credit. What turned her on was making magic happen. And if that was easier with her behind the curtain instead of in front of it, that was just fine with her. She was a one-of-a-kind and a one-of-a-kind example of how to be and how to get things done with a one-of-a-kind impact on our work. And as one who loved chasing around intractable problems, Nancy would have appreciated, I think, our topic for today. Taking stock of where we are with climate change. Talk about a problem to solve. Climate change has been billed as a whole of society challenge, and our approach today on this panel will be to examine the question of progress through a number of key societal lenses: governmental/intergovernmental, the private sector, the finance sector, and civil society writ large. We've got a great lineup of panelists. I'll get them introduced to you as we move through the agenda. Leading us off will be Sue Binias. one of the U.S. State Department's senior most diplomats working on climate change. A good friend of ELI, Sue, was able to drop by to be with us en route to the airport as she's headed off to do the very work we're talking about today. Briefly, Sue is the right hand of Special Envoy for Climate John Kerry, and has for more than 25 years served as the lead climate lawyer for the United States. In that capacity, she's played a central role in all major international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement. Her other roles in her storied career at the Department of State have included leading the Treaty Office and the Department's Legal Office for Oceans, Environment, and Science. In short, no one has been more influential in the international dimensions of our work than Sue. Along the way, she's also taught at Yale University, Columbia University, University of Chicago, and served as a senior fellow at the UN Foundation. So I give you Sue Binias.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, I thought I would take you back to 2015 when we were concluding the Paris Agreement, and just to give you a little bit of background on how we ended up with the so-called global stocktake. I don't think stocktake is even a word, so I can't really, so every time you type it, like the computer rejects it. But anyway, that's where we ended up. But why? There were several countries on the road to Paris. They called themselves the High Ambition Coalition, and the United States joined them sort of towards the end. And they were very interested in making sure that the agreement was a long-term agreement and that it had what they used to call an ambition cycle, so that countries would put forward their nationally determined kind of emissions commitments, and then there would be some kind of sort of collective or aggregate review of how the parties were doing. That review would inform the next set of nationally determined contributions, et cetera, and so on, until the goals of the agreement were met. Now, not everybody was convinced that that was a good idea, but what happened was towards the end of the period right before Paris, countries had put forward their kind of intended, as we called them, nationally determined contributions, and they didn't really add up to what the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement was supposed to be. It had been already kind of agreed that the temperature goal would be to limit global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. And if you added up all of the so-called NDCs that were on the table, or about 185 of them, they added up to something closer to 2.7 degrees. I think that's what put the global stocktake over the edge, where people realized like it was untenable to have a Paris Agreement with that set of initial NDCs without structuring it in sort of a long-term way, with a long-term design. So that was the genesis. Now, so what does it look like, the global stocktake? Well, it was written to be a collective review, which is really important. I think Jordan or Scott, one of you mentioned, like, how is the US doing? That's not really an issue for purposes of the global stocktake, because the global stocktake doesn't look at how is each individual country doing. That's more the transparency regime under the Paris Agreement, where you have to report and be reviewed individually. This is more the collective, how is the world doing. It's supposed to take place every 5 years, and it was agreed originally the Paris Agreement wasn't supposed to enter into force until 2020, so it was considered a perfectly reasonable time frame to have the first one in 2023. It ended up, kind of surprise, entering into force in 2016, so it felt like kind of a long time to wait for this first global stocktake. But anyway, that was the reason for that date. The other thing to know about it is it addresses all three of the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. So people tend to focus very much on the temperature goal of, well below 2, 1.5. But actually, it looks at all three and a little bit more than that. And just as a reminder, the three goals of the Paris Agreement, the first one is, of course, this temperature goal. The second one is to enhance adaptation and resilience. And that was kind of a topic that had gotten a lot less attention before the Paris Agreement. And the third is related to finance, and and probably Chuck will talk about this, but it's to align financial flows in the world with those other two objectives. So those are the three long-term goals, and the global stocktake is supposed to look at all three of them. Further modalities were elaborated under the Paris rulebook after Paris, but I won't get into those details. Now, one other thing to know about how the global stocktake is structured is it's supposed to inform, as I said, one of the purposes is to inform the next round of these nationally determined contributions. And the next round is in 2025. So the next set of targets are due in 2025, and they are supposed to address the 2035 time period, okay? So 2025 with respect to 2035 emissions targets. So that's kind of the background. Now, why is this first one important? It's important for a few reasons. First, it sets the precedent for what these global stocktakes are going to look like because it's the very first one, so that's obvious. The second one is it sends the signal to the world, to the marketplace of how the parties think they're doing, what's missing, what needs to happen next. And the third is it kind of shows whether the parties to the Paris Agreement are, as we say, like up to the task of reviewing themselves. If they're not able to reach agreement, or you come out with like 2 pages instead of a more kind of fulsome assessment, it really won't look good for the Paris Agreement. So what should this global stocktake decision look like? I mean, I will give you our view, like from an ideal perspective, this is what it should look like. So for each topic under the global stocktake, and so this is each one of the long-term goals, we think it should look, have sort of backward-looking and forward-looking pieces. So it should look at the positive progress that's been made on that issue since 2015, since Paris was adopted. Then it should look at, okay, are there gaps? What's missing? What still needs to be done? And then it should look at the forward-looking pieces, which are, what are the responses? Okay, so now what? What do we all agree should be done? So just to take mitigation as an example, in terms of progress, we would probably say, hey, before the Paris Agreement, scientists, and we have a scientist who can correct me, but scientists used to say, we're on track to the high 3s in terms of global temperature rise, or maybe even 4 degrees centigrade. Now, depending on which metric you use, we're much closer to 2, and some will say if everything were implemented that's been committed to, we'd be on track to 1.7. So clearly we're in much better shape than we would have been without the Paris Agreement. 200 countries have put in nationally determined contributions. Way over 100 have updated them already, even though they didn't have to until 2025. Over 100 countries have put in long-term strategies. Everywhere you turn, Paris has become kind of the North Star. You can't open the newspaper these days without seeing some reference to a Paris-aligned target or a net zero goal. All of these concepts sort of come from the Paris Agreement. And other international fora that we work in have also tried to kind of align themselves with the Paris temperature goal. So if you go to the International Civil Aviation Organization, they've now taken on a net zero goal and adopted measures to try to get there. This past summer, the International Maritime Organization did the exact same thing. So clearly a ton has happened since Paris was adopted. But gaps. If you look at IPCC reports, especially the latest 6th assessment report and reports of the International Energy Agency, there are, we are not on track to keep a 1.5 degree limit within reach. And so that has to be kind of honestly and clearly spelled out. And then the question is, okay, so what do we do about it? If you read the IEA's reports, they would say something along the lines of the following: you have to decarbonize the energy sector, and that has a renewable energy component, which I think Jennifer will talk about. It has a fossil fuel phase out, phase down component, depending on which country you're from. It has a component of reducing non-CO2 gases, which often get overlooked, and they're responsible for about 1/2 of warming to date. Methane and HFCs and other non-CO2 gases. You have to halt deforestation by 2030. And in terms of the next set of NDCs, what's really important in our view is that they need to include all greenhouse gases. Some of the major economies of the world have only included CO2 so far, and in order to keep on a 1.5 degree trajectory, those countries really need to broaden the scope of their NDCs. Okay, so that's kind of the response. And then what are the challenges? And then I'll stop and leave the solutions to the challenges to everybody else.
Generous of
Yeah. So one of the challenges is it's a consensus process. And in our world, consensus means the absence of a stated objection. So it's short, one notch short of unanimity. You don't need everybody to say, I affirmatively love this outcome, but you need nobody to stand up and say, I can't accept this outcome. That is incredibly difficult when you have 200 countries with very, very different interests. So that's challenge number one. Second challenge, I think, is balances, I would call them. You have very different views out there of how much to focus on progress to date versus gaps. Some countries will just want to say, Paris is a failure, let's not focus at all on the good, let's just focus on the bad. Others probably want to focus only on the good and not really get into the bad. And even if you agree on the gaps, there'll be lots of disagreements about the responses and who's responsible for those responses, which leads me to the third one. There's some countries who I think, I call it like buyer's remorse. They signed on to the Paris Agreement, but they don't really love the design of the Paris Agreement. Paris moved beyond the developing dichotomy that was in the Kyoto Protocol, which was the reason that the United States rejected the Kyoto Protocol, and it took many, many years to create a new paradigm. And one of the beauties of this nationally determined approach was that you could get rid of the categories because it was a form of like self-differentiation rather than two different categories that had been maybe relevant in 1992, but were certainly not relevant for the post-2020 era. But there are some large countries pushing, kind of using the global stocktake as a backdoor way of trying to renegotiate the Paris Agreement and go back to here's what needs to be done, but that's the responsibility of the developed countries only, even though the developing countries are the major emitters at this point in time. So environmentally, it wouldn't really solve the problem. Last challenge is money. Of course, it will take money to implement the kind of responses that we're talking about. And that will be a defense. I think for some, it's a legitimate defense. They're nervous about going down the road of adding more responsibilities on their plates, even though these are going to be written about in global terms, not national terms. But for some, it will be used as more of a cynical defense, because they don't want to do or be held responsible for doing more. So I'll stop there, and sorry that I have to talk and run.
You have
Thanks.
time for a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. We promised Sue we'd get her out of here by 3:30, but we have a couple of minutes before that, and we can take one question from the floor for her. Yes, right here. Hang on a second, they're going to bring you a microphone.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you for being here. Could you just quickly touch upon the loss and damage controversy and the insistence of the World Bank playing a role in sort of where you see some of those using the same framework you just set up and taking us through where that's likely to end up?
I can do it. I can't quickly do it, but that could be like a week. But in a nutshell, loss and damage became an issue way before Paris, but it was basically included as an article in the Paris Agreement. The idea was to talk about, it addresses a category of impacts that really can't be adapted to. They're kind of like beyond adaptation. Now that was fine, but then several years later, really at the Glasgow COP, which was 2 years ago, there was a push by some of the more vulnerable countries to have funding to address loss and damage. Now that was a completely new issue that had not been included in the Paris Agreement, and it was controversial, but it was agreed to do some dialogues on the subject. Fast forward another year at the COP last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, the push went beyond that, and it was, it's not good enough to have a bunch of dialogues. You have to have an outcome to the dialogues, and we really should be establishing funding arrangements and a new fund to address these loss and damage impacts. So what's been going on, and that was agreed to, this whole past year, there's been a smallish group, about 24, looking into establishing funding arrangements, including a new fund. They just met last week for what was supposed to be the last time, but they didn't quite reach agreement and they ran out of time. There's going to be another meeting of that group. But the issues are kind of like the where, the to whom, the from whom, typical, I guess, kind of legal issues. Where should this fund sit? Should it be a World Bank fund? Should it be this type of fund or that type of fund? To whom issue, like the Sharm el-Sheikh COP agreed that the beneficiaries of the fund would be the particularly vulnerable countries. So that's become an issue. Is that all developing countries? Is it some developing countries? Do you leave it to the board of the new fund to decide who they are? Is it just the small islands and the least developed countries? Is it more than that? That's still an open question. Then you have the issue of from whom, as I call it, and that's the issue of like, how broad is the invitation to contribute? Is it just developed countries? Our argument would be absolutely not. We're in completely new, uncharted waters when it comes to loss and damage. There is no donor group when it comes to loss and damage, and everybody should be invited. And if you can contribute, great. But it's, some countries, largely the big developing countries, want to sort of make sure that they're not invited to contribute. So those are the types of issues. One thing that's important just for an American audience is one of the preconditions for going down the road of loss and damage funding was this is not about liability and compensation, and that's like written into the mandate, because that was a sensitive issue for the United States in the Paris Agreement. And when we agreed to this loss and damage article, even though it wasn't about funding, it was very important to stipulate that, because I think the chances of getting funding for a fund that is pitched as sort of a compensation or like reparations type fund would be very, very slim. So that was an important kind of proviso. So anyway, that group is going to meet again in about a week or so, and so hopefully that will actually be resolved before we even get to the COP, and then we can focus at the COP on the global Stocktake. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question. With that, we're going to release Sue. Thanks for coming and being with us. Safe travels. Okay, as Sue's making her exit, maybe just a couple of contextual observations to set the stage for the remainder of the conversation. Let's remind ourselves what the United States' current nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement is, and that is to reach by 2030 a 50 to 52% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels. And this, in turn, is calibrated to a goal that the Biden administration has set of achieving net zero emissions no later than 2050. Our country's positioning relative to this objective was dramatically improved by last year's passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, generally viewed as the United States' most important national climate legislation to date, although climate is not in the title, in that it is expected to drive major new investment towards renewable energy. That said, analyses of that law's reach indicate that while the IRA will help push us towards the NDC goal, it can't get the job done on its own. The IRA, along with complementary electrification initiatives, sets us instead on a path to roughly 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, as opposed to the 50 to 52% reduction envisioned by the NDC. So how to make up the difference? Some had hoped that regulatory action by EPA might close the gap. But the Supreme Court recently took a big bite out of what had been seen as EPA's primary tool for regulating greenhouse gases, the Clean Air Act, in the court's June 30th decision in West Virginia versus EPA, saying essentially, Congress, if you want to equip an agency like EPA to transform the energy system of the country, you need to say it more clearly than you have so far. And of course, the current Congress is not in a position to say anything, clearly or not. But the federal government is not the only government in the United States of America, so a key question going forward is whether state and big city governments can pick up the slack and help close this gap between the country's climate ambitions and its actual performance. And there's no one better able to help us think through that than our next speaker, Angela Barranco. Angela is Executive Director for the Climate Group in North America. Angela has 2 decades of political and policy leadership experience, most recently as Undersecretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. Prior to that, she served as a Chief Executive for River LA, as Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and led climate and environmental outreach for the Obama White House as Associate Director for Public Engagement of the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Under her leadership, the Climate Group is working to strengthen partnerships and networks across states and sectors to drive impact in pursuit of a prosperous and climate-safe future for all. So thanks for being with us, Angela. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I will just jump in. I think there's been, especially Sue touched on so many issues that I think we will pick up as part of our discussion. But in the world of subnational, I think, I'll first just talk a little bit about Climate Group and maybe some of the infrastructure that exists right now to help drive action at that subnational level. We as Climate Group are a global nonprofit. We are the secretariat of this group called Under 2, which is the governments, the subnational governments group officially that is a part of this process. And what that means is that we have over 173 individual states, regions, provinces, and subnational governments that are part of this global coalition, including many here in the United States. And we have co-chairs that really guide the direction of that action and are very actively involved in every COP, including California, who's our regional co-chair, KwaZulu-Natal, Sao Paulo, Scotland, and South Cheongnam in Korea. So a really interesting, very action-oriented group that is coming together really since the Paris Agreement sort of defined this whole new world called subnational action, actually. It was really interesting to sort of go back in time with Sue a little bit to kind of remember what the constraints or some of the opportunities that we created at that time. And, one of the big pieces was sort of the definition of this subnational action, right? So it had been so focused on federal, on governments, on large international agreements, but what I thought, and our fellow speakers will talk about a little bit of this, what was very interesting about Paris, I think it also changed the paradigm around subnational, but also around private sector engagement and bringing a lot of those folks to the table as sort of equal actors in mitigation and resilience. So, in addition to the work we do in subnationals, Climate Group also runs several mitigation, strategies in different industries with our corporate partners. I only mention this to come back to it and sort of break down the silos, but we work in industry and transportation. We work in built environment, food, and energy. And so just to give you a sense of the scale of the work that's happening, we're just one NGO of many, many others that are kind of really thinking about this. But we've kind of arrived at this moment, and I'll talk a little bit about why subnationals are so important, but that the traditional barriers between public and private sector really are kind of tumbling down. I feel like that's the big shift, the paradigm shift we're seeing now, right? I think with Paris, it was about, putting concrete thoughts and ideas about this global stocktake, and also these other actors that have to come to the table. Now we're sort of seeing the scale of the problem growing on a day-to-day, daily basis to such a place where you kind of can no longer think of it in silos, right? It can't just be one industry sort of focused on their event or their typical things. Everyone has to kind of be collaborating and moving together. And so that's where state governments especially become a really interesting driver of ambition and action, right? So, you know, Sue touched on a couple things that I'll just talk about, you know. In that big shift, and like I said, almost paradigm shift of who was at the table, what we've also seen is almost this transition from this notion of green economy to the economy, especially in the United States. I mean, IRA really changed so much of that framework, but what we're seeing that is across the globe, you know, these are not just sort of, you know, a boutique sector of jobs. It's now becoming critical pathways for economic development, critical pathways for workforce. It's become the sort of bread and butter economic, you know, underpinning of these states and these governments. And so the states and state leaders, whether they be city leaders or whether they be governors or even, you know, county leaders or other entities, really focused on how they make this just transition, right? And so I'll sort of flag that as one piece that is really, really important for subnational action. You know, there oftentimes, you know, like in the United States, some, you know, but it varies, right? Federal governments can only do so much, right? So much of it gets implemented at the city or the state level, and things like workforce and you know, that kind of local economic development is really driven by these leaders. And so, bringing them to the table is going to ensure that as we are thinking about this incredible transition, that is really rooted in those communities. It's rooted in the benefits of this enormous transition, so that climate isn't just a mitigation strategy, right? It's a whole new way of looking at the world for the benefit of all, right? And I think that's the ideal that we kind of are working towards. I will note in the United States in particular, there's a very interesting, I think, sort of moment where Justice 40 and some of the work that has been done in IRA and IIJA and BIL and different acronyms I can throw out here. But, you know, really all this climate work has really also prioritized investments in, you know, impacted communities or communities that are considered frontline. That is kind of a new thing. And I would say Scott is thinking about this for much longer, which is really exciting. But to kind of see us to be in a place where that is built into the policy, into the way that people are thinking about economic development is a model for others across the world. So we're seeing within our Governor's Coalition a lot of interest in policy mechanisms to ensure for those transitions to be really fruitful for all, right? The second piece I'll just talk about is filling those gaps, right? We talk about carbon a lot, and I think a lot of this is now suddenly people are sort of opening their eyes, you know, methane and other gases are truly have to be addressed, right? One, the scale of the problem is growing, and we need to address it all a lot faster. But two, things like agriculture, waste diversion, all that is handled at the local level. And so, you know, if you think about cities, you know, a city like New York City, they make a decision about, say, organic waste that has large, broad impact. I mean, it's not to solve the global climate change crisis, but if a lot of cities come together and make some, you know, big choices, it can have a real impact. The same goes with agriculture, the same goes with, you know, deforestation. Another piece of this, you know, resilience and adaptation. Again, big governments, you know, they can set big policies, sometimes have big dollars, but those resilience and adaptation projects are going to be done at that local level. And so in some ways, especially resilience and adaptation really hits, you know, the rubber hits the road at that local level. And so having those governors, having those city officials at the table really being ambitious in terms of how they want those communities integrated, how they want those communities protected, and also, you know, kind of economically integrated into this is really, really, really critical. And then the last thing I will say is it's transparency and accountability. You know, I think we have seen even in our own politics that the shift in one year to another can be rather large. And I think there was a really challenging moment. There is, I will say, continues to be a challenging moment for the United States on the global stage to ensure or assure many that our policies are resistant to big changes, right? And I think the adoption of a lot of this forward action, of this ambition, of this work at the state and local level really is resilient in many ways to those large, large political challenges. And that's true not just in the United States, but across the globe. We have 16 governors in Mexico that are a part of our coalition, and what we hear time and time again is the federal government in Mexico operates very differently, but it's not really prioritized climate as much as some of those governors would hope. But those governors are taking on a lot of this work, whether it be workforce, building up the workforce of the future so that they can build and transition and do all that great work, or just adapt, right? Like whether it's heat island effects or other things, they're making those investments in those communities at that level, regardless of what the federal government is doing. And so I think it's a real incredible place of opportunity. We are not moving fast enough, I will say. Our governors and our mayors are kind of, just getting organized, just getting to the table. And so there's a lot more work we can do there. But I will say though, and the last point, transition to our next speaker is, it's not just good enough to do it there, right? The partnership really has to be public-private, because at this point, a federal solution is only going to be a part of the problem. I don't know if you guys heard, she said, IRA will have a impact of about 40%. We still need the rest. And that's all going to come from a whole lot of places, including public-private, and we have to really start moving sort of in sync together. And I think that breaking down those barriers is something that I'm sure we are all working on in some respect or another.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela. We are going to take a question from the floor for Angela, if anyone has one. And I'll mention that we're going to have a general Q&A at the end, so this isn't your only opportunity to ask a question. But sometimes something comes to mind more acutely right after the speaker has spoken. So does anyone have a question for Angela? Well, I have one. You talk about the breakdown between, or breaking down the barriers between public and private sectors. Do you think, based on your work with the states and what's happening with renewable energy trend lines, has the promise to break down barriers a bit between red and blue states?
Oh, absolutely. Because, someone told me Indiana is one of the leading renewable energy producers in all the country. And I was like, really? What? Turns out, they love their wind energy there, and they believe in all sorts of other incredible opportunities, but just don't say the word climate. And they're more than happy to talk about, the beauty of renewables and how the investment in Indiana is really having great progress and great Indiana jobs. So I think if it's a question of language, let's use whatever language you need to use. But it comes down to jobs and people's workforce and their pocketbook issues. I think people will be on the right side of things. I would say also what's really interesting is I was chatting with a friend of mine who works with the ag sector, and he even said, 10 years ago, you could not go into any ag community and say climate. But the ag community itself across the country, and this is not just in blue states, across the entire country, has really come, 180 in terms of their appreciation for both tracking and adaptation with climate, but also being a part of the solution. And so I think the grounds are shifting around that, maybe less than they are in DC.
Very good. Thank you, Angela. If you look back over the last decade or 15 years, it feels like government performance on climate change has been sort of a stutter step. It's been very difficult to maintain continuity in the face of political change and shifting priorities at the national level. We've seen that here at home, but it's equally true in countries all around the world. And the fact of the matter is that it's been hard for all governments, democracies and autocracies, to sort of maintain the course when it comes to climate change and increase ambition. And this has led to increased focus on the contribution of so-called non-state actors, some of which Angela has just been talking about, and in particular the business community. And the belief and hope is that businesses aggressively decarbonizing their own operations and those of their supply and value chains can be a key ingredient in reaching our climate goals and compensating to some degree for government unevenness in this area. So here with us to focus some light on what's happening in particular in the private sector is Jennifer Huang, who's Associate Director of the International Program at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. C2ES is, of course, a leading presence in this city and in the country on climate change, and is at the vanguard of work with companies to inform and educate business leaders, strengthen corporate climate action, and mobilize business support for effective climate policies. At C2ES, Jennifer facilitates dialogue among international policymakers and manages C2ES's own global Stocktake project, which she'll be talking about, in hopes of developing a framework and impetus for enhanced climate action. She also tracks and researches international climate policy, focusing on the key issues in the UNFCCC negotiations. In her deeper background, she's worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality and with the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn, Germany. A lawyer by training, Jennifer has an LLM degree focused specifically on climate change. So please, Jennifer, your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me here and being a part of this fantastic lineup of speakers. It's my pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know C2ES that well, we're a think tank, but our international work really focuses on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, and as Scott mentioned, I've been managing our project on the global Stocktake. But we also work with a number of stakeholders, particularly on the domestic side, including businesses and cities. So in my remarks, I wanted to speak to C2ES's theory of change for the global Stocktake and our hopes and expectations for that outcome at COP28, and I'll touch on the non-party stakeholder engagement in the global Stocktake as well, and this kind of moment for accountability that we find ourselves in. So Sue did a really great job of covering what the global Stocktake is. She really laid out different aspects of it that make it a unique mechanism, not just in the international community, but for the UNFCCC itself. And she mentioned that it's going to be an end of a 2-year process that will inform new nationally determined contributions, but another important aspect is that it's meant to enhance international cooperation, which is a theme that I'll touch on. So the global Stocktake is actually still a negotiated outcome, and this conclusion of this process is happening during an evolving political landscape. Parties had a really difficult meeting in June and were unable to kind of address the substance of what this GST decision will look like, and they don't have a lot of time to work on this at COP28. So some more progress was made at a recent negotiator meeting in Abu Dhabi, but we still don't have a text, and there's very little time left to do this. But what Sue had mentioned as their ideal global Stocktake is really not that far away from what we see as well. What we really don't want is what some parties may think of as the global Stocktake just being a Paris report card, just telling us what we already know, just telling us that we maybe have a failing grade at meeting our Paris goals, but it doesn't really have to tell us that we're just falling short. It can be a moment to inspire us. It can be an opportunity to course correct and to direct us into a better future. So to add real value, we think that COP28 and the global Stocktake outcome should identify a limited number of very specific operational transformative signals that can come out of COP28. And that should be across mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, means of implementation, but it should also speak to all stakeholders, national governments, local authorities, civil society, the private sector, national level practitioners, multi-organizations, UN agencies, among others. So the greatest momentum we see right now is behind this potential target to triple global renewable energy capacity by 2030. It's part of the COP presidency's vision. It's also part of the recent outcome of the G20. But we think if you call for an increasing share of renewable energy and electricity generation to reach about 2/3 by 2030, with the aim of full decarbonization by 2050, could be a really useful way to kind of nuance that signal. But it also should be matched with a commitment by parties and multilateral development banks and international financial institutions and non-party stakeholders to at least triple that proportion of finance and investments in renewable energy by 2030 as well. And together, this could really be a useful package that directs parties and civil society in their actions over the next few years in that context of enhanced international cooperation. But it's still far from certain that we would get this kind of energy target. So we need to build momentum around this ahead of COP28, including by activating existing relevant coalitions and initiatives around them, in particular the work of the high-level climate champions. But even if this target is agreed at COP28, it's not going to be useful or operational unless there's some sort of follow-through to implement it. So we hope that COP28 sets out a clear plan for what will happen next so that all parties and non-party stakeholders are clear as to what's expected of them in an effective year response and to implement that renewable energy target. So you could do something like a series of ministerial and technical meetings in 2024 to follow up. And then COP28 should as well require that COP28 and GST outcomes are clearly linked to this process of submitting these new nationally determined contributions that are due in 2025. So for the second part of my remarks, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the engagement and accountability of non-party stakeholders. I mentioned earlier that the global stocktake is unique, and even in the UNFCCC space, it's unique for allowing fairly open engagement of non-party stakeholders. They were able to sit at the same tables with climate negotiators and speak freely during the technical dialogues, and their inputs and contributions are part of that historical record for the global stocktake and were taken up in the synthesis report that came out recently. But there's still interest, despite about this global stocktake largely being about collective progress of parties towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's still interest in tracking the progress of non-government actors towards the commitments that they have publicly made. And I think the global stocktake sits in this wider moment of desiring greater accountability by those who have put forward commitments to address and act on climate change. And Angela did a great job of speaking to this incredible evolution and engagement of non-state actors from just before the Paris Agreement until now. We have countless net zero pledges, large coalitions of actors who've joined campaigns like the Race to Zero, and an explosion of initiatives that are also dedicated to deforestation and nature-based solutions, and other efforts to address climate change. But these pledges have also been accompanied by a proliferation of criteria and benchmarks and narratives with varying levels of robustness, and it gets confusing, and it can generate a lot of confusion for consumers, investors, and regulators. So I'll speak to two separate but related initiatives that are building momentum right now and generating a lot of interest in that non-party stakeholder space. The first is, this is a mouthful, the UN high-level expert group on net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities. So the H-leg for short is what they decided to go with. But the UN Secretary General in March of 2022 established the H-leg to develop clearer, more rigorous standards for net zero pledges by non-state actors and to kind of speed up their implementation. And the H-leg group of experts delivered on their mandate by delivering a report and called the Integrity Matters Net Zero Commitments by Businesses, Financial Institutions, Cities, and Regions at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the report is meant to serve as a guide, provides 10 recommendations on how to set credible, accountable net zero pledges and considerations. And then the Secretary General earlier this year also called on these entities to put forward credible and transparent transition plans and to submit them before the end of the year. And then moving into the UNFCCC space, the UNSG also asked the UNFCCC to present a plan to address the lack of universally recognized, credible third-party authorities that can conduct verification and accountability processes. So at COP27 then, UNFCCC parties welcomed this approach and responded to that request by inviting the Secretariat of the UNFCCC to ensure greater accountability of the voluntary initiatives that come through this portal called the Global Climate Action Platform. And in June of this year, the UNFCCC has launched consultations on something called a recognition and accountability framework and draft implementation plan. So they propose to use those principles from the H-leg to individual non-party stakeholder and net zero pledges that are registered in that Global Climate Action Plan. These consultations are co-chaired by Sarah Bloom Raskin, the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and Dr. Bing Lang, a member of the International Sustainable Standards Boards. And through this framework, the UNFCCC can usefully strengthen this accountability framework for voluntary initiatives so that you have more ambitious, credible climate action, and that's supported by international cooperation. But there's ongoing debate. This is a very sensitive topic right now about how much of a role the UNFCCC should and can have in transparency and accountability of voluntary initiatives. There's a strong concern that if you take a very prescriptive approach this way, you can kind of stifle the ambition and the willingness to do more that you want to see. So if of interest, there will be virtual town hall discussions in November ahead of the COP, and the main output anticipated from these consultations are a set of operational guideposts to be released at or around COP. So wrapping up, we're just under 40 days until the start of COP28, and as always, there's more to be done than there's time for, but I hope this was a useful window into our vision for the outcome for the GST and an update on developments around non-party accountability.
Thank you, Jennifer. A question or two from the floor for Jennifer before we move on. There's a question in the back over here. You see it to the back right, my back right. Microphone's coming to you. Go ahead.
Can you speak to the issues about carbon removal? Along with this year, there's a lot of scrutiny about the overestimation of especially natural carbon removal. And you speak to bring more verification of the whole carbon strategies within the UN framework.
That is actually not an area that I delve that deeply into, but yeah, if you want.
Carbon removal?
Yeah.
I know what he's asking.
Go ahead, Charles.
I can cover it.
Oh,
Do you want?
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, take it now. Charles Leva.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I'm going to speak to the issue of carbon markets and one proposal to set up a system for carbon offsets is to include removal activities as an activity that would be financed, and then the buyer of those activities that remove carbon from the atmosphere gets credit for that activity. There's a lot of controversy over whether removals meet the integrity that Jennifer was talking about in terms of demonstrating permanence of the removed carbon and what kind of test you put in place over the life of that removed carbon to ensure that it stays out of the atmosphere. Because if you remove carbon, but it leaks 3 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 50 years from now, you may defeat the very purpose of that offset that took place. So there is a supervisory body that I'll talk about a little bit more that's has a working paper on whether removals can be included in the what's called Article 6.4 carbon market activities under the Paris Agreement. And I want to tie it into some other element that I'm going to speak to. So I'll leave it at that for a minute.
Thank you, Charles. I think there was one other hand up. Was I right? Maybe right in front of Maddie? No? Okay. All right. Well, in that case, we will move the agenda forward to the man who's just been speaking. You know, one of the hopes is that the finance sector can play an important role in leveraging and incentivizing and enabling transformation of energy and other carbon-intensive sectors. And in much of the world, that leverage is expressed through development banks like the World Bank that can condition access to capital
on climate-safe behaviors. And we have with us today an expert on climate finance in the development bank sphere, Mr. Charles DeLeva. Now an independent sustainability advisor, Charles was for many years the World Bank's principal presence on all matters environment through his roles as Chief Counsel for Environmental Law and Chief Officer for Environmental and Social Safeguards. He represented the bank in international treaty negotiations, including with respect to climate, also played a key role in the development and implementation of the bank's environmental, social, and climate policies. Formerly, I might add, Charles was director of the Environmental Law Center of the World Conservation Union, or IUCN, and served as a senior program officer with the United Nations Environment Program, and in the deep days of yore, served as a trial attorney with the Justice Department's Environment Division when Nancy Firestone and I were there. Charles has taught on trade, finance, and environmental law at George Washington University School of Law and American University's Washington College of Law. I think Charles has somehow managed to expand his speaking time through answering that last question.
You can offset the comment that I made.
Over to you.
But before I start, Scott, I'd just like to thank you and Jordan and Pat for the honor to be here at the first Nancy Firestone Forum, somebody who many of us deeply miss, and it's wonderful to be here in her honor. Yes, she would see climate change as a challenge, and she would tackle it. So the multilateral development banks are seen as having an increasingly important role in tackling the climate crisis. The global stocktake that we've talked about has highlighted the role of MDBs, as has recent G20 communiques. And in fact, I think you go back to the UNFCCC, and there's always been understood that international organizations have a role, and the World Bank has certainly been a part in the Global Environment Facility establishment, the climate investment funds. It's worked with the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. There's many different actors on the scene, but especially under the new World Bank president, Ajay Banga, there's a deep commitment to collaborate with the other multilateral development banks. I don't think we've ever been in a space where the collaboration amongst the development banks to tackle the urgent climate crisis has been so well understood and agreed upon. Everybody understands the urgency to act sooner. And indeed, starting this year, the World Bank has committed that all of the public sector financing of the World Bank, 100%, would be Paris aligned. And for the private sector part of the World Bank, the IFC and the MIGA, they will do so by the beginning of 2025. And they're already largely in that direction anyway. But it's understood, and I think Jennifer hit on this, that you need private sector capital multifold beyond what's capable of being generated through essentially the public sector organizations that own the multilateral development banks. And we're talking a scale of 5, 6, 7, 8 times more the private sector capital to be brought in. That's one of the reasons why President Biden has made a pledge that he wants to ask Congress to appropriate an extra $1 billion for callable capital into the World Bank, because it's recognized that multilateral development banks can stretch public finance to enhance bringing in the necessary private capital that we've all spoken of, and that the global stocktake says is really essential. So the World Bank is trying to put in place a number of measures to do that. The new president has spoken about the essential element of de-risking private capital's entry into the field of climate finance. And through that, you identify that if private capital is going to go to address the fact that today 63% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from emerging markets and developing economies, you need to help deal with the various risk factors that private capital faces when they're going to markets that don't have the stability of a US or a Japan or most of Western Europe. So how do you do that? You need to create the attraction to private capital to be willing to put money into an investment that may not get the guaranteed rate of return that you would otherwise get when you're operating in the US. So there's political risk, currency risk, extreme weather event risks, and all of these types of risks have tools and instruments that the multilateral development banks are setting up through their different arms to try to address. So part of the challenge, though, at a time when we understand we have to drive this capital toward climate change, is the fact that we have a unique set historically in terms of the number of crises that are being called upon for development institutions to address. There's still the need to deal with high unemployment with the recent pandemic. There's still the fact that many of the regions in the world are dealing with food insecurity. There's still the fact that we have a biodiversity crisis that has not generated the kind of finance that's coming out of in the climate world. And in addition to that, we've seen some very powerful voices come from the global south about the challenge of generating capital to deal with climate crisis when so many of these countries are under staggering debt. And that's not just low-income countries, it's often middle-income countries as well. So the debt inhibits the renewable energy investment that the IPCC is saying is necessary to get to 1.5 degrees. So the wealthy countries, and including China, need to find a way to start to work on debt relief to free up some of the capital that can help us generate the new technologies. And there's been some good examples that recently China's willingness to work with the multilateral community in Zambia is seen as like one good step in the right direction of dealing with debt relief. But another challenge that I think has just come to bear in the last couple of weeks that I find very interesting is Sue mentioned the International Energy Agency, IEA, which has really done great work over the years to be a really credible, strong voice in terms of where the world needs to go in terms of addressing fossil fuel emissions. And what's very interesting is to look at the fact that Fatih Birol, who's the head of IEA, has said very clearly that, in his word, the kind of transition that we are seeing, and that's been described, including in the work that Angela's discussed, indicates that we should be reaching peak oil by 2025. But there's a very, very interesting coverage the last couple of weeks that you can see in the Financial Times about Exxon purchasing Pioneer Shale for $60 billion. And then even more recently, Chevron purchasing Hess for a similar amount. And in each cases, it's Exxon investing in continued extraction and increased extraction in the Permian Basin. And what Hess had a high degree of ownership on was the Guyana Basin, which is seen as one of the largest untapped oil reserves in the world. So if these are to be developed, then there is a direct, strong question over whether this concept of peak oil is really where the world is headed. And many in the environmental community are very worried that what is happening is a sense among some participants in this global debate that it can be okay to, quote unquote, overshoot the 1.5 degrees, because the removal type activity that the gentleman asked about before is going to somehow enable us to go beyond 1.5 and come back to 1.5 by eventually taking out of the atmosphere the carbon that's there. And so some of the technology that's being debated now in the carbon markets discussion under Paris are what types of technologies is the Paris Agreement world willing to consider to be acceptable under Paris market approaches to be used to offset emissions. And let me just step back a little bit to Sue's comment about Kyoto Protocol. The United States was a tremendous force in designing the Kyoto Protocol's market mechanisms. The Clean Development Mechanism was created under the Kyoto Protocol to set up means for purchasing reduction offsets in the developing world. Well, today, there's the Article 6.4 mechanism that's trying to build on the CDM and improve it to deal with credibility, integrity of a carbon market that has seen itself hammered about the head recently by analyses by Cambridge University, Berkeley University, this New Yorker article that came out last week challenging the carbon removals, land-based carbon removals in Zimbabwe. There's been a lot of challenge that, if the private sector is going to rescue us by the carbon market going forward, they need to do a better job of market activity that is credible, that is permanent, that avoids leakage, and that is truly additional from what otherwise would happen. So the carbon market discussion is a critical one to follow, and it's one where the multilateral development banks are trying to bring the credibility of their operation into those types of activities, because they operate from the beginning of the operation and continue to monitor it through to the end. The role of the bank in looking at these emerging markets and developing countries that are critical if we're going to turn the corner and start to reduce the emissions as we want to, is to help set these countries up so that they can track and authorize emission reductions in a way that the market is going to feel confident that if they invest in these type of activities, they aren't going to be subject to greenwashing claims, or, as we saw recently with Delta Airlines, brought into a class action lawsuit by passengers on Delta Airlines that felt that they were misled by the claim that they were flying on an airline that was carbon neutral. And that case was followed by one against KLM not long after. So if we're going to have the private sector do this, we need to help set the rules and the credibility so they can really achieve that obligation.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. I imagine that might inspire a question. Yes, there's a hand up in the middle. Hang on a second. Hey, Frank. It's right over here in the middle on this side. Raise your hand a little higher. There we go.
Recently, there's been a lot of discussion in terms of the offshore wind development, particularly the question that whether or not the...
I don't know if the
Can you hear me? Okay.
Why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Okay, I'm Frank Friedman. Okay, will that do, Scott? Okay.
That's good.
Recently, there's been a lot of discussion in terms of with respect to wind development offshore, particularly in the U.S., where the economics have somewhat diminished in terms of the incentives have not been sufficient, permitting processes, and in general the costs that's happening throughout the world. I was wondering if you could discuss that and see what, in fact, are the possibilities now that there are some significant issues with respect to wind development.
And you may have views domestically on that. I think wind technology certainly will be one that will have methodologies that will be approved by this new Article 6.4 mechanism. I should say that there are two types of market structures under the Paris Agreement. One is set up for bilateral deals between, and so far there's been several, Japan and Switzerland doing deals with developing countries, and then when they do that deal, Japan can support wind, solar, green hydrogen activities in those countries, and then Japan, Switzerland can claim within Article 6.2, we have offset emission reductions and we will claim credit under that through our domestic regime and as part of our national determined contributions. One of the challenges that some of the market colleagues have told me about the wind is, in some cases, the price is becoming so competitive with your fossil fuel that it's becoming less attractive to bring capital into that type of investment. So that's a challenge. And so perhaps they have to find ways to create additional incentives, perhaps from a World Bank side, for example. One of the things that the World Bank has been talking about is that if an investment is really delivering environmental benefits, then perhaps they can lower the interest rate that would normally be charged to the borrower for entering into that type of investment. So I think it's important not to let the fact that the marginal cost curve is coming down between the renewables and traditional fossil fuel investments discourage what would otherwise be an important renewable investment.
Very good. I think we'll we have another question, but why don't you, Larry, if you don't mind, hang on to it. We'll come back to it in the general Q&A. Is that all right? Fine. Okay. Perhaps the ultimate player in a whole of society pursuit is society itself, all of us. In response to this daunting problem of climate change, civil society is being asked to care more and at times make different choices than we might have made in the past. And collective clarity within civil society and a shared sense of purpose in dealing with this problem can enable improvement in all the systems that we've been talking about here. It can help clear out political underbrush that impedes government action. It can help create consumer demand that accelerates the move to market of climate-sensitive products and services. The challenge of arriving at a greater common accord on climate change is a function of public education and moving hearts and minds. And who better to help us think about how we can up our civil society game than our next speaker, who is someone already deeply involved in informing public understanding on climate change, and that's this year's Environmental Achievement Awardee, Dr. J. Marshall Shepard. We'll be hearing more about Marshall's amazing career later this evening, so I'll be brief here. Originally a research meteorologist at NASA and later deputy project scientist for the Global Precipitation Measurement Space Mission, Marshall is currently director of the Atmospheric Sciences Program and professor of geography and atmospheric sciences at the University of Georgia. In November, he will become Associate Dean of Research, Scholarship, and Partnerships in the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences at the university. Marshall is quite simply one of the world's leading thinkers, teachers, and advisors on weather and climate science. He is also host of the Weather Channel's award-winning podcast, Weather Geeks, a senior contributor to Forbes magazine, and a regular guest on CBS Face the Nation, PBS Nova, The Today Show, CNN, Fox News, the Weather Channel, and other media outlets. In 2021, Marshall was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, some of the highest honors that a scientist or engineer can achieve. This in addition to many other awards and accolades, including the one he will be receiving later this evening. So it's my pleasure to give you Dr. J. Marshall Shepard.
Thank you.
Please, Marshall.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I know that we've been sitting here, so if anyone wants to take a little break to stand up, I'm happy to take a pause. Otherwise, I'll start into my remarks. You know, I was sitting here thinking about the metaphor of the ordering of the speakers today. And as I think about the beginning of my career, coming out of Florida State as a young scientist, thinking about extreme weather and climate, as I walked through the metro or walked into a mall or a restaurant and someone found out that I was a weather or climate scientist, I was still in a mode of having to convince people. There were narratives about hoaxes and this isn't real, or it's the solar variability or a natural cycle. What I often call zombie theories, these things that live on, although scientists like me have long sort of refuted them. But as I look now, the science has done its job in some regards. The climate is doing what our models said it would do. And now the economy, policy, and law needs to rightfully take front center as we deal with this crisis. I think carefully about that because as I thought about my remarks today and tonight, the Environmental Law Institute and what many of you in this room are doing, that will need to lead to charge going forward. So I wanted to talk from several perspectives today. I'm actually in Washington, D.C., multitasking as I normally do. That's sort of my MO. Just this morning, I was on the Hill. I'm a part of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission that released this report today, Forging Climate Solutions. And this report is a readable, actionable, approachable set of ideas put forth by a very ideologically diverse group of scholars, CEOs, and stakeholders. And so we were marching it around to the various policymakers and stakeholders. And much of what we talk about in this report is very much at the center of some of the discussion today. And so it was really important for me to engage in that activity as I came to this activity. I want to also talk about another report that I co-authored for the National Academy of Sciences back in 2016. Because though the science has essentially sort of moved us to a point of where we can say that climate is certainly happening, the extreme events that we face are becoming more extreme, and it has a particularly high impact on certain segments of our society, which I'll say a bit more about. But nature is making the case for us, and as I told Congress when I testified before the House Science Committee in 2019, it's the extremes that people, our infrastructure, and our economy feel more than the average. So we've been talking about this 1.5 degree, 2 degree, those are the targets that we hear about in the Paris Agreement. By the way, by show of hand, I am a professor, I have to give one pop quiz. By show of hands, how many of you know what 2 degrees of warming is in Fahrenheit? Not very many of you, but yet we talk about it in this space all the time in Celsius. But here in this country, I don't speak Celsius. I do as a scholar and as a scientist, and most of us do. But my wife made this point to me earlier. She's like, well, why do you all talk about this in 1.5 degree and 2 degree in this country? I don't know what you're talking about. 3.6 degrees of warming is 2 degrees of Celsius. That's even a bigger number. And so I use that when I think about engaging outside of the spaces of our communities because, you know, in terms of our collective discussion, and I often find that resonates. But I want to kind of circle back to vulnerable communities, marginalized communities. I've done studies. We published a report or a paper in 2021 looking at what communities in the United States would be vulnerable to climate change by 2040. It's a publication that looks at various factors, both social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, policy levers, and the extreme events themselves. And what we know is that communities of color, elderly communities, and certain communities living in poverty will disproportionately bear the brunt of the challenges that we face. And so I am a card-carrying physical scientist. I spent 12 years of my career at NASA developing large space missions to study Earth's climate before moving to the University of Georgia in 2006. I do host a show for the Weather Channel and write for Forbes. And I say all that because these days, my job as a scientist isn't enough. What I mean by that is when I talk to my own students, or when I talk to stakeholders, or when I talk to a senator or someone at the White House, I often talk about how our scholarly system from the science perspective is broken. We teach scientists to be scientists, but we're in an era where end-to-end science is needed. As I think about the discussion today, this is end-to-end science. You have a scientist at the table, we have policy makers and policy advocates at the table, we have economists at the table, we have attorneys, lawyers at the table. Our collective action is what will be needed, because I can tell you this, my community in Canton, Georgia, a rural community that I grew up in, or Cascade Road in Southwest Atlanta where my wife grew up, they're not thinking about anything that any of us are saying today, right? They just know that when it's 107 degrees, right, and their power is out and there's no access to a cooling station, right, or the variability in the production of pecans or peanuts or cotton in our state is being disrupted. They don't speak any of this language because at the end of the day, they see things as a local issue. They might not even call it climate change, for goodness sakes. So when I think about the work that I've evolved to do, and I said I'm a card-carrying physical scientist, because if you go and look at my publication record and the things that have gotten me into the national academies, they're very much science, theory, models, development of new satellite techniques. But in the last 10 years, much of my work evolved to think about taking this climate crisis and this wicked challenge that we face and thinking about it from the lens of vulnerable communities. I don't know if you saw or remember Hurricane Katrina from 2005, a really interesting event because it disrupted one of the most petrochemical intense regions in the United States. Many people were vulnerable, but the people that we stared at in our television screens at the Super Bowl was a community that was highly impacted, but likely had the least amount of impact on carbon emissions when we're thinking about Stocktake. So these are some of the things that I think about today, and I think it will take local, regional, national, and international actions. I think about some of the things that we've done in the state of Georgia when we were talking about needs for gap-filling activities here at the table. I've been involved, and the funding came from a private foundation called the Ray C. Anderson Foundation. Ray C. Anderson was the former CEO of Interface Carpets. He calls himself an environmental industrialist. And we took the broader project drawdown framework that some of you may be familiar with, and we looked at it because they talk about 100+ solutions for reducing carbon emissions to get us to hit our targets. But what that effort did not do is say what works in Georgia. And so we quantified what it would take, and we estimate that we can reduce carbon emissions in Georgia by 67 megatons by 2030 with 20 very focused solutions. And not a haphazard approach. We looked at the numbers of what of those 100 solutions make sense for Georgia given our landscape and our transportation infrastructure and our building infrastructure and so forth. And so I say that to say we are going to need the state of Georgia and other jurisdictions to step up, but there are efforts in place ready to go when these organizations are ready or when these state actors are ready. So I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to focus on communication. I mentioned end-to-end science, and I gave my little pop quiz on 2 degrees versus 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that still is a part of the problem. I think we have to engage and find ways to, when we're not only talking to our wives, but also when I was just on the Hill talking to staffers, there are still basic misunderstandings about aspects of the science. And I just realized, I was here in the DC area for 12 years, and as I was walking around on policy in Capitol Hill. Every time I come here, I realize I don't speak DC perimeter speak anymore. I've lost that art because I used to know it well. But yet, as I think about where we go going forward, we'll need to engage. And the final thing that I'll say in my remarks here, and I'll certainly open it up when we have our open Q&A, as I scan the room, in all of our spaces, whether they're environmental law space, climate space, policy space, many of the very people that I just talked about, I don't know that we're still represented in our spaces. I'm just scanning the room. And I don't know what the solutions are. I think about it all the time in terms of getting more engagement and representation in my field, but also perhaps in yours as well. The good news is my daughter is a pre-law and she wants to go into environmental law, so hopefully she will help to engage. And you know, it's really ironic when I got this award, because I said, you know, I'm speaking to a bunch of environmental lawyers, so let me know if you need a reference letter. But on that note, I'll stop and hopefully we'll have some engaging Q&A.
Thank you very much, Marshall. You know, I think if you play your cards right, there might be an internship at the Environmental Law Institute.
That's right.
Okay, I think we'll, I'm sure we have some questions for Marshall, but I think we're just going to take this into the general Q&A. Larry's got his hand back up again, so Larry, please, let's get a microphone to Larry.
Great panel. Great panel.
Introduce yourself first.
Oh, sure. Larry Liebesman, been practicing environmental law for a few years. Scott and I go back a few years, but I want to ask you about carbon pricing. Now, many economists around the world have talked about the importance of putting a price on carbon as a great way, as a mechanism to really incentivize the markets, generating revenue, et cetera. And if you look around the world, so many countries put a price on carbon, Canada, Europe, et cetera. And I know here in this country, there's been a lot of resistance in terms of the environmental community and the business community about pricing carbon. And now we have a price for methane in the Inflation Reduction Act, but that's a small piece of it. And I'm just wondering, and I'd like to get some thoughts about why carbon pricing might be an important element in terms of creating market incentives towards clean energy, providing a revenue source, and looking around the world as to how it's operating and how this can fit into the other measures that Chuck and the others were talking about, and sort of incentivizing these markets. And in fact, whether it's a viable mechanism, politically may be difficult, but there's a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby that I've been involved in that actually has some interesting bipartisan legislation where they've really thought this through with economic analysis about what kind of revenue could be generated, where the funds could go towards infrastructure, towards distressed communities, for example. And still, that has gotten some traction on the Hill, has not gone very far. So my general question is carbon pricing. Can it work? Can it make a difference? Is it a non-starter? And are we an outlier in terms of the world approach to this very issue?
Okay, thank you, Larry. Great question. Angela, you want to take a crack?
Sure, I'll start only because I have the California perspective, and California does have a carbon market that is currently delivering some really interesting lessons. So I think on the one hand, it is a very challenging discussion. I think rightfully there's pushback that talks about if you are pricing essentially the pollution in communities that are already distressed, that's sort of monetizing the pollution that's going into these communities. But what you can see also on the other hand in California is this, I want to say decades long, but I think it's longer, investment in reorganizing kind of the investments in these communities, right? So in essence, they have a carbon market. The proceeds then on a quarterly basis get redistributed into all these different types of programs that California's been able to utilize, right, to sort of drive their climate momentum. I will say, a national carbon market was on the table in the first half of the Obama administration, and it really died on the hill of politics. And I do think partially it was a timing issue, but I think also a communication issue. So, to sort of pick up a little bit about what Dr. Shepard was saying, I think we have to be very mindful of how we present these opportunities because, the folks who are making the decisions aren't always the most educated on all the components of what is actually happening, right? And so, love or hate or want or not like, Waxman and Markey, we are now here today. I think, what will be increasingly challenging is doing that at the federal level. So just to kind of sideways answer your question in that way, I do think it's going to be state by state. So states are going to find ways to do this. I know several Canadian states are also very interested in joining those carbon markets, and others in other places, like we also operate a lot in Latin America, whether it be Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, they're all very interested in joining those markets. And so I, in some ways, think that the subnationals will kind of come to the table like Quebec and California have to kind of prove a model that could work and could provide benefits for all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. Other thoughts, including this question of whether our difficulties at the federal level to do this kind of puts us out of step with the rest of the world?
Well, we were not out of step with the rest of the world when we had a national Clean Air Act emissions trading scheme to deal with sulfur dioxide. So, and I think that's why there was a point when there was maybe the McCain-Lieberman mill was not Larry Liebsman, but the senator, who, and I think that was the sense coming, and that's why the US was such a proponent of the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms in '97, because the US saw that it could work across 50 states to have a system of putting a price through a cap. And now many other countries of the world use the Clean Air Act in the US as a model for creating what Angela's talking about. So, no, if we can't get the global community to agree on a global cap and a global price, at least if we can have 1,000 flowers bloom, to use a bad metaphor, we can perhaps start ratcheting down by these kinds of pricing mechanisms. And then you also see like what the EU has just done on the border carbon adjustment in terms of the amount of carbon that could come into any product coming into the EU. That's another way of setting a price on carbon. Right.
Thank you, Charles. Other questions? Yes, in the middle over here, on this side. Raise your hand a little bit higher.
Thanks, Scott. Ira Feldman. To bring us back to the global stocktake for a moment, those of us working on the global stocktake are also involved in the closely related parallel effort on the global goal for adaptation. And I was going to ask Susan this question before she left, but the rest of you are stuck with it. Do any of you have any thoughts on the progress or lack thereof on the global goal for adaptation?
Yeah, I could start. I have a colleague who works more deeply in this, but from everything that I've been listening to this year, I think it's a really difficult conversation. I mean, dealing with adaptation as its own kind of agenda under the UNFCCC has lagged for years behind what mitigation is. So everything that this global goal for adaptation is trying to do is sort of set these headline targets in a similar way that mitigation does, but without the sort of methodologies and the measurement and verification that has supported everything that has supported mitigation through these years. So I think it's a difficult discussion on how do you get really a big signal that can kind of inform the rest of the work under the UNFCCC and build something like a global goal that you can measure progress to at each and every global stocktake, and then have that feedback into all of the mechanisms, the bodies that have been created sort of in an ad hoc way over all of these years, and kind of coordinate that better under the UNFCCC. So I think parties have their work cut out for them this year, as always, to try and kind of come together on a framework that's operational. I think one outcome could be is that they put forward a framework that just really puts forward more work programs for the year to sort of elaborate that further. But I haven't been following these glass workshops through the year as closely, so I can't dig that deeply into those, I'm sorry.
I think one thing that contributes to it, Ira, is that under this Article 6.4 mechanism, in other words, the mechanism that replaces the clean development mechanism, now there's an agreement that 5% of the what they call share of proceeds from each transaction would go into the adaptation fund. And perhaps that's part of the reason where I understand that the United States is thinking of also contributing to the adaptation fund, which they had not done previously. And then in the multilateral development bank world, I know the World Bank and I think the others have committed that now that they're aligning to Paris, that their climate finance will be split equally between mitigation and adaptation, and that was not the case earlier. So I think there are, and you know, when you have strong voices like Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister from, I think, Barbados, pushing the adaptation agenda, the voices are there. It's much stronger than I think it was in the past.
Thank you, Charles. Did you give up the microphone, Ira? I won't ask this of other questioners, but it sounded like, given your positioning on this issue, you might have an observation or two for us on how the process is going. What do you think?
In a phrase, it's not going well, particularly on the global goal for adaptation. And I'm working with several groups that are planning on issuing position papers on the global goal for adaptation at the beginning of COP28 next month.
Okay. Thank you, Ira. And again, I won't do that to everybody. I don't want to chill the questioning. Lee Paddock has a question up here in the front.
Yeah, there's a question in the back.
We have one in the
been
back
back there
as
for
well.
a while.
Lights are preventing
Yeah,
it's really hard to see.
Yeah, all the way in the back. I've seen her for a while. But
okay, I'm sorry. Please.
Hi. Just a quick question, and not to turn away from this subject, but you were talking about ranking those climate actions. You had over 100 climate actions that you were considering in Georgia, and talked about some of the considerations that you took into ranking those and deciding what was just fit for Georgia. But could you talk a little bit about how public health impacts or co-benefits might impact how we decide which climate actions to take, especially when we're considering through the lens of equity or through the lens of environmental justice for vulnerable populations, how that plays into climate action?
I was having a little trouble understanding what you said. I heard the first part.
The co-benefits. She was asking.
Yeah, I think we're having a little bit of trouble with the acoustics.
Are there
Can you hear me now?
That's much better.
Like licking the mic, sorry.
Can you mention your name too, please?
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Kelly Crawford. I'm a former air pollution control officer and environmental engineer. I'm now at the Department of Energy, a senior advisor for energy and environmental justice. My question was, when we're considering climate action, can you talk a little bit about using the lens of equity and environmental justice when making those considerations, especially when you're making accommodations for vulnerable populations?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, and I really appreciate what I'm seeing with the Justice 40 initiative that's happening, at least within the federal space, because I think that that's something that has been missing in the equation. I can't specifically speak to sort of the policy levers in terms of equity, but one of the things that I wrote down in my notes here as I was listening to the discussion is I'm always thinking about not just the climate justice side of extreme weather and climate, but also the equity lens on the solution space. One of the things that I'm always concerned about is even as we have well-intentioned actions on solutions, they often might be on the backs of some of these very vulnerable communities. So I often caution that as we think about these initiatives, as we think about Justice 40, as we think about I look at, for example, what's happening in parts of South Florida with what I call climate gentrification. There are people that are fleeing, spaces along the coast, for example, for obvious reasons with sea level rise. But then they're moving into communities that have long been communities of certain backgrounds and culture and displacing those folks. And so you've got this sort of climate gentrification challenge happening. So I think I caution at the national, state, local, and international level. And I think the international level really is leading on this in some regards. They're very attuned to the equity issues around some of the solution space that often get lost, but are well-intentioned. I call them climate microaggressions. So.
Yeah, and I think many of the carbon market projects that you see covered in the newspapers and magazines that are subject to being considered greenwashing are those that not only had problems with improving their carbon offset, but often because they failed to deliver the benefits to the local community that was supposed to share in the profit that came out of that transaction. And so the proposal before the body looking at the carbon markets now on this article, sorry, 6.4, sorry, but is to mandate a screening of how the community is engaged in that project, and to include in the mechanism a grievance and appeals process, so that if the stakeholders believe that that removal project or that carbon offset didn't adequately deal with the impacts to that community, the benefits to that community, they have recourse to deal with it. So I think this is, it's both a local and an international issue that these kind of activities need to consider environmental and social justice.
Exactly.
Thank you, Charles. Realizing that the lights in the back really are affecting our ability to see the folks with their hands up in the back half of the room. So if the staff can help get the microphone to whoever has a hand up, please.
Hi, Scott, this is Sheila Jones. I want to follow up on the last question and the response. One of the things that I think we are missing woefully, in this country at least, is the outreach to the people in these communities who are going to be affected most. Positively, if the projects work, negatively, if they do not. And many of them have other issues, economic development issues and so forth. But here's the question. Can someone speak to what we are doing at federal, state level, and local level to make sure at the outset, when these projects are being considered, right? Because that's where you got to get in. We all remember NEPA cases, right? We did those. Or some of us did anyway. You got to get in at the front end. So can someone speak to that, just so that the folks in this room and the people who may hear this recording have an understanding of that component? Because if we aren't doing that, it's better than nothing, I guess, to have that process. But people need to know about it, and they need to know about it up front. And this is maybe your question, perhaps, Dr. Shepard.
Yeah, I was going to actually jump in on that, but others feel free to as well. One of the, I work with, some of you may know her, Catherine Coleman Flowers, who is a leading sort of voice in the space of environmental justice. She's been dealing quite a bit with septic and sewage issues in the Southeast, and her nonprofit has really been talking about some of these issues. In talking with people like Catherine, one of the things that and I think you're alluding to this, one of the things that we've learned is that much of what is happening in that space is being done by the frontline communities and frontline organizations. And there are now opportunities, funding, and so forth, coming from the recent legislation and bills passed, Justice 40 initiatives and so forth. But what we're finding is that there is a significant barrier. Many of these organizations have no clue about the process of accessing funds or engaging in sort of these processes that you need to be at the table at local, state, and federal level. So I think a first step, and I think we're starting to see some of this. I know, for example, EPA has recently issued a set of grants to, I think even, for example, ISC, I see a hand waving back there, Institute of Sustainable Communities and others, to help these technical assistance efforts to help sort of bridge the gap in that very strong barrier that exists in that engagement. Because you're right, you have to co-produce from the start, co-produce knowledge and solutions, as opposed to coming in blaring with our PhDs and with our agency badges saying this is what we think you should do.
Okay, thank you, Marshall. I think Angela had a supplement.
Yeah, this actually harkens back to a bit of work that I did with the LA River, because I think the co-creation element that we're kind of getting at is is kind of like the next stage of NEPA. I think NEPA and a lot of this, and I know I'm speaking to a room of environmental lawyers and I'm getting a little outside of my specialty, but more as a converted scientist, like, thinking about communications and engagement as really critical to the kind of stickiness of this stuff all in the future, right? So I think there's a defense point when there's something that's coming to a place, we have to figure out how to make sure that that thing happens in a way that is least harmful to a community. But there's also this really interesting opportunity, when we're talking about large infrastructure investment, that all of that money, all of that energy, all of that time that goes into even doing something like revitalizing the LA River, which people think are sort of minimal. I would love to talk with anyone about that because I have many ideas, but is an opportunity to engage and create community cohesion around this infrastructure that is going to be climate resilient. And I know I'm gonna jump into public engagement wonkiness, but all the good science in the world and all the good laws in the world will die if there's not a community that supports and is engaged and is a part of the process to create these projects, because those projects then live in that community and either are used or not utilized or are created with the backs to that community, right? We look at all the infrastructure that was built, in the 50s and the 60s, a lot of it was about turning your back to that community, right? And, freeways and all that stuff are great examples of this. But I say this to say, we need to think of the infrastructure around the engagement of community as both sharing power, sharing process, but then also the longevity of these opportunities within a particular community. So, I think there's lots to be said there. And then also the components of sort of anti-democratic forces and breaking down, that, I'm just expanding this conversation and, tenfold. But the truth is that, I think some of the things that we're seeing is environment and climate being used as a political tool to sort of break down some of this work. And so what we have to do as proponents of climate is to rebuild some of the infrastructure, because if folks feel like everything is against them, that things are disconnected, that's never going to be the pathway to actually get things done. So I said a lot there. I think you know what I meant. But I think that's the thing, is it's really hard, but it's in the infrastructure of our communities that we're talking about, right? It gets that deep. And I think the more we go to that place together, I think the more successful we're going to be.
Thank you, Angela. I think we have time for one more question. Oh, Lee, you never got to ask that question. Maybe we'll get two questions in then real quick. Go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Nikunj Beria, and I'm the founder of Alt Surya, which is a carbon measurement firm. My question is open to the panel. So does carbon accounting need a greater push at the industry level and at the subnational level? And is carbon measurement a necessary step to meeting the climate goals?
Reactions, thoughts?
I got the second question. I didn't really catch the
Can you
first.
give us the second question once more, please?
You maybe answer the second question.
The second one was, is carbon measurement a necessary step to meeting our climate goals? And the first one is, does carbon accounting need a greater push at the industry and the subnational level?
Well, I think the answer from wearing my scientist hat is we clearly need a better carbon measurement capabilities at a gross global scale, but also at a local scale. So during my time as a scientist at NASA, there were several missions being developed to measure sort of what I would call global scale carbon emissions, and some of those are actually in orbit now. So we've actually made progress at the local level as a part of that Drawdown Georgia effort that I mentioned. I'm at the University of Georgia, but we do work and play nice with Georgia Tech. And my colleagues at Georgia Tech have developed a greenhouse gas tracker at the county level within the state of Georgia based on some research mechanisms that have been involved. So I think that The challenge oftentimes with carbon measurement, there are still some challenges with the efficacy of the technology, but also scale mismatches as well. The scales versus the scales that you need to make decisions on. So I think there is still room for improvement. But to the second question, the answer is yes. I'll let someone else handle the first one.
Thank you. Go ahead, Charles.
On the first, I think there's 3 reasons why you need an industry to maintain carbon accounting. One are the shareholders of the industry when they ask at a shareholder resolution, how much are we emitting? Second is the possibility that they may be regulated and asked to outline, especially as I think maybe Jennifer mentioned earlier, that methane's already being, or Scott, you mentioned it, methane's already being regulated, but it may be regulated at the state, municipal, national level. And the third is if they want to participate in offset markets, then in order to avoid the cardinal sin in carbon markets, which is the possibility of double counting the same emissions, you need to be able to track it to which group is authorized to claim that they have the carbon accounting, so you don't do it twice. So at least 3 reasons, and I'm sure there's
Great.
more.
Thank you, Charles. And Marshall, Lee, you get the last question. Lee Paddock.
So Lee Paddock, George Washington University and ELI. I just want to ask a quick question on the Stocktake in terms of momentum and U.S. versus the rest of the world. Last 10 years, we've seen a lot of momentum in the electric industry with both push and pull from government and pull from industry itself. And we're seeing it this year, next year in EVs. The third big area to me is the building sector. And it seems to me that same momentum is starting to build in a significant way, both in private sector and in what government is doing. And I'm wondering if some of the panelists might have some comments on it, because this may be a reason for being a little more optimistic looking forward.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, buildings, one of the big 3. We always talk about power sector, transportation, and buildings as being the 3 places to look for big carbon reductions. But thoughts from the panel on the buildings question and whether this momentum he's talking about is in fact building?
Yeah, I would just add, I don't have much to say there, but I would just say that was one of the key of those 20 solutions in Georgia. I mean, we broke out the sectors into 6 areas of focus, and building certainly was one, and that was where there were potential significant savings.
To mention another state, Idaho. So you have Idaho has just built a new sports arena with laminated timber in which they're tracking the embedded carbon that would otherwise have been in carbon-produced steel. Yep. And there are a lot of building codes now that are starting to plug this in. And what I think, well, would be interesting to see what the President Biden's procurement initiative does in terms of mandating the possibility of getting extra points if the product is embedded carbon, or if the glass is going to increase the amount of resilience and less emissions. So I think there's going to be a whole revolution on the green procurement side in terms, and the building sector is obviously a big part of that.
Angela?
Oh, I just wanted to add, yes, I love that you brought laminated timber up. That's amazing. Yeah. But I think there's a really interesting also opportunity, obviously, as companies are thinking about Scope 3 and really trying to think through like all of the different components that they have at their disposal. But then also, there's just also very interesting, and I guess I'll play the role of merging everything. I'm the merging everything person on the panel. But transportation and built environment are really now being thought of together, right? Like, and you can't really separate those two, too clearly now, and the same with energy. And it's this just fusion moment of all of these different opportunities and people really seeing them, just right at their doorstep. So I think there's a lot of hope in the built environment and a lot of place that people want to go, not just because it's good for the environment, but good for their bottom line, and that's a great thing.
And thank you, Lee, for bringing us around to the idea of hope as the last point of focus. We've run out of time. We're a minute or two over, so we are going to adjourn. The conversation's been great. Let's keep it going, but feel free to chat with us as we exit this forum. Those of you who are sticking around for the reception and the dinner, there will be lots of additional opportunity to talk and to hear Marshall speak some more, which would be a pleasure for sure. If you don't know where the reception is, just listen for the noise and you will find your way to it. A few thank yous. First, for the life and example of Judge Nancy Firestone, really the reason for our formation today. And thanks to her family, Pat and the rest of the family, for making this event possible. Thank you to all of you for your presence here and your attention. And last but certainly not least, thank you to our fantastic panelists for a wonderful conversation today.